Hey everyone, welcome back to Installation 00, and today here's another video on 10 things you might or might not have known about things in Halo. In the previous video we looked at 10 things you might or might not have known about the Spartan 2s, and today we continue in a similar vein and look at MJOLNIR powered assault armor. Let me know in the comments at the end of the video on how many of them you already knew, and leave suggestions on what you want me to cover next. In the meantime, sit back and relax. The lore aficionados will enjoy this video as just a general retelling of some deep lore, and for those of you who don't know these facts, you're due an education. So, let's roll the intro. The Mark 1, Mark 2 and Mark 3 platforms are not MJOLNIR. I feel like I need to elaborate on this one significantly. So, in truth, there were actually a Mark 1, Mark 2 and Mark 3 MJOLNIR platform, but they were early prototype versions of the armour that were completely pre-production, and ultimately served as the primary testbed for numerous technologies that Dr. Halsey was employing to develop a finished article of MJOLNIR powered assault armour. These experimental suits ranged from 2515 to 2525, and while bulky and cumbersome to use and having to be tied to an external power supply, the suits did pioneer a lot of innovative technologies in regards to artificial muscles, embedded computers, and software control systems. When most people think about the Mark 1, Mark 2 and Mark 3 platforms, they think about the large exosuits that predated Project MJOLNIR entirely, and these were not MJOLNIR. They were platforms from a program called Project Hunting, which was the earliest and longest lived military exoskeleton project, with the earliest platforms developed in 2166, predating Halsey's platforms by nearly 4 centuries. Only the latter Mark III Hunting was adapted to finally become the Cyclops, a powerful pilotable mech suit that was used aboard the Spirit of Fire. As a side note, it's worth noting that MJOLNIR is not the only powered exoskeleton program in development with the UNSC over the entirety of the Human Covenant War. Hunting was another such example, as was Project Yggdrasil, which created the Mark 1 and Mark 2 armoured defence systems, or more specifically the prototype suit. And then, as I've covered in a more recent lore video, there was the Orion Exoframe Load Carrier, which was a form of armour developed specifically for the Orion Super Soldier program. Many of these programs were either retroactively included into the line of MJOLNIR platforms or became their own merged multi-role programs that gave birth to platforms like the Mantis and the Colossus. MJOLNIR's name relates to the fact that it cannot be wielded by a normal human being. In similar vein to the mythological application of the word MJOLNIR in regards to the Hammer of the Gods, this mighty weapon of war, wielded most notably by the god Thor, was so heavy and powerful a weapon that only Thor could actually pick it up and wield it. While others could pick up MJOLNIR, they couldn't necessarily use it due to its immense weight. Relating this back to Halo, when MJOLNIR powered assault armor was first sent off to be assessed for production by the Office of Naval Intelligence, they used a Marine in order to activate the armor for the first time and move it. However, MJOLNIR responded so rapidly and so powerfully that it broke the bones of the man's arm. The pain-induced spasms that he then experienced were magnified and amplified by the MJOLNIR powered assault armor, causing uncontrollable tremors and shaking, which further damaged his arm, causing a feedback loop whereby, had the armor not have been shut off, it would have killed him. Interestingly enough, Halsey does detail in her journal that she did in fact have certain mechanisms built into this test prototype to limit how much power and speed the MJOLNIR armor output, but somebody turned them off before testing. It would appear that that particular feature of MJOLNIR powered assault armor was phased out entirely once it was fully approved, leaving only the Spartans, godlike human beings, capable of wielding it. MJOLNIR is expensive as hell. Though a price tag is never explicitly put on a single platform of MJOLNIR powered assault armor, it is generally quoted that a single suit of MJOLNIR costs approximately the same as a small starship. Again, this is a very generic term, because by small starship do they mean frigates of the UNSC, or do they mean small civilian-class starships? In which case, diplomatic vessels like the Han that Dr. Halsey used in order to identify some of the early candidates for the Spartan program could be classed as a small starship. So it's never explicitly stated what end of the spectrum they're relating to small starship. But what is known is that the single most expensive aspect of the Mjolnir-powered assault armour is its energy supply, the micro nuclear fusion power pack in the backpack, which, while being a significant technological breakthrough, is also prohibitively expensive. The very first Mark IV prototype didn't look like Mjolnir much at all. After years of development, Dr. Halsey finally developed a finished platform of pre-production Mjolnir-powered assault armour that she sent off for assessment by the Office of Naval Intelligence. And this platform didn't actually bear many of the key characteristics of what the Mjolnir Mark IV platform would ultimately become. The shape, form and ergonomics of the suit as a whole more closely represented that of the Orion exoframe loader, with some very telling signs of ODST and marine battle armour thrown in for good measure. The eerie thing about this particular design, however, is that upon looking at it, you can see a lot of inspirations for the more modern Keystone Gen 3 platform than any other previous Mjolnir platform itself. The helmet has the much more prominent double vents system, the two vents on the front of the mouthpiece as well as the two on the side of the cheeks. The forearm and bicep armour looks much more akin to the Mark VII Gen 3 arms than any other platform. And even the abdominals, the waist armour and the gloves seem to mimic permutations of the Gen 3 platform that we've already seen in application. But when one thinks about it, it's hardly surprising given that the Gen 2 platform moved away from a lot of the design ethos of the Gen 1 platform. And the Gen 1 platform was headed by Dr. Halsey, while the Gen 2 platform was subcontracted out to numerous corporate contractors, resulting in a much larger diversification of innate styles. With Halsey's return to the Mjolnir platform for the Gen 3, it's hardly surprising that some of those older inspirations made their way back in to the newer platform. Mjolnir's development cycle accelerated dramatically through the war. Work on the very first platform of Mjolnir-powered assault armour started in 2511. The first finished prototype wasn't ready for review until 2525. Later that year, the first Mark IV platforms were ready for the Spartans to suit up. Small iterations were made to the Mark IV platform during the subsequent decades, but the next clear platform, being the Mark V platform, wasn't released until 2552. And while yes, the Mark V-B platform existed marginally before this, the Mark V-B is classed as a form of subcategorization of the marked platforms. The Mark V platform was only in service for a few months before it was entirely supplanted by the Mark VI platform. A handful of Mark VII testbeds were produced around the same time, but were ultimately supplanted by the Gen 2 platform, which, as previously mentioned, was a massive diversification in form and function, with dozens of new variants being released in a very short space of time. The next from the ground up rework of the platform entirely was the release of the Gen 3 platform, which, as we know, was reopened in 2558 by Dr. Halsey. But the very fact that 3 of the 4 original marks for Mjolnir-powered assault armour all happened in the final year of the Human Covenant War is definitely a remarkable point, especially considering the immense innovations that were made across those 3 platforms. The micro-nuclear fusion power pack is the single most expensive component of the Mjolnir platform. However, the earliest platforms of Mjolnir did not have a fusion power plant. The earliest versions of Mjolnir had a nuclear fission power pack. Fusion is arguably a cleaner, more powerful, and all-around safer form of energy, fusing isotopes of hydrogen together in extraordinarily high pressures and temperatures to generate energy, which is then siphoned off and converted into usable energy by a process known as electrostatic direct energy conversion. Altogether, if anything was to go wrong with the fusion power pack or the fusion reaction as a whole, the reaction would simply stop happening and the armour would power down. Fission is a slightly different beast. Nuclear fission is when heavy atoms are split, releasing huge amounts of energy but also creating radioactive byproducts. The immense heat and energy released can then be used to boil water, which can turn turbines which generate electricity. These micro-fission power plants that were powering the earliest platforms of Mjolnir were doing exactly this, but of course if something was to go wrong, you then have a unit on your back which is filled with radioactive material, and a runaway fission reaction could take place, causing basically your own personal version of Chernobyl. Needless to say, these risks were deemed much too high, as simply grazing or damaging the casing that holds the reactor could cause the reactors to go into meltdown. And since these were supposed to be wearable battle armour, and thus be in environments where damage is more than likely, this was most definitely rooted out as soon as humanly possible and replaced with what we now know to be a micro-nuclear fusion power plant. You don't have to worry about going to the bathroom in Mjolnir. It's a valid question and it's been brought up a lot, and while we do have definite guaranteed answers to one particular avenue of dealing with waste products, there's one that's subject to interpretation. Spartans, when entering their suits, are catheterized. This means that a small tube is placed in the urethra that Mjolnir then kind of plugs into. Mjolnir then filters the urine of any toxins or pathogens and ultimately purifies the water for recirculation. Going off of only Naomi's quotes in regards to her Mark 7 platform, saying, and I quote, "This suit plugs into me into more places than I care to mention," seems to suggest the idea that the suit also effectively has something approximating an enema. In theory, it could even be that the water that is purified for recirculation isn't actually used as drinking water, but as the liquid medium necessary for the performance of an enema. It's also worth noting, however, that Spartans' digestive systems are much more efficient than normal humans' digestive systems, and as such, the food that they eat and how efficient that their digestive and gut bacteria really is, the likelihood is that Spartans don't really need to go number 2 anywhere near as often as normal humans. What the suit does with this waste once it's been physically extracted, one can only speculate, but in the interests of being a self-contained system, the most logical thing I could imagine was simply route it to the nuclear fusion power pack and carbonize it. I admit it's a much less glamorous aspect of Mjolnir to have to talk about, but hey, it's a valid question, and a valid question needs a valid answer. But again, like I say, in some regards it's left open to interpretation, so I'd be more than willing to hear your opinions on whether this suggestion makes sense or if you have your own. Every suit of Mjolnir has a failsafe. It's seemingly only been used once as far as I can tell in all of the books and lore that I've read, but due to the immense technological innovations that went into Mjolnir powered assault armour and the need to keep those technological innovations away from enemy hands, every single suit of Mjolnir has a failsafe built into it which allows any suit's nuclear reactor to be overloaded. Since it's a fusion power pack rather than a fission power pack, the net result isn't a nuclear explosion, but instead an escalating temperature gradient resulting in an explosion. Basically, the fusion power pack overcharges to the point that it incinerates anything within a 10-meter radius, after which the hardened casing finally gives way and explodes, destroying the armour and the occupant inside, thereby denying the enemy of the ability to reverse engineer the technology. Every single Spartan on the field knows this failsafe code, and at least with earlier platforms there was a panel on the back of the armour where this code could be put in, although it is at least possible that newer platforms have a command override where Spartans nearby can activate that particular failsafe in the circumstance that one of their brothers or sisters in arms falls in battle. As I previously mentioned, at least to my reading, there seems to be only one situation where this has been applied with a Spartan 2, and that was with Grace aboard the unyielding Hierophant. The worry, especially around the created, is that, in theory, This system could be engaged by created AI and basically turn every Spartan into a small bomb. In truth, it is at least a possibility that that's exactly what the UNSC AI Leonidas did to the Spartans on board Laconia Station. Mjolnir's reaction time is insane. Now, we already know that Spartan 2s, Spartan 3s and Spartan 4s have received augmentations to increase their reaction time, giving them on average a 300% increase in reaction time. So I did some long form maths to find out exactly how fast those reaction times could be, and then did the same calculations for Mjolnir, but it needs a little bit of explanation. I'm going to do a more in-depth video surrounding this, fully explaining exactly why I came to the conclusion that I did and reason it out, but basically the punchlines are this. A human's reaction time is governed by what's known as the nerve conduction velocity. When a given stimuli elicits a reactionary response from the human being, this can only happen as fast as the nerve conduction velocity will allow. This is basically how fast electrochemical signals can move along nerve axons. For the average human, that's 150 meters per second at maximum for the central nervous system and around 60 meters per second for innervated muscles. Taking this into account and the distance from the motor cortex in the brain to, say, the bicep being approximately 70 centimeters, reaction time from stimulation to movement can be as little as 21.5 milliseconds for a normal human. Spartans have a 300% increase in this reaction time, leading to a central nervous system velocity of 450 meters per second and an innervated muscle reaction time of 180 meters per second, giving an overall reaction time of 7.16 milliseconds, which is incredibly fast. Where Mjolnir shines through, however, is that Mjolnir is tied directly to the Spartan's physiology by the Spartan neural interface, which is a superconducting filament of transductors built into the midbrain of the Spartan, with particular interface with the motor cortex, meaning that this Spartan neural interface can pick up the neural impulses of movement at their source, convert them to a digital signal, and send them along the superconducting fibers of the Spartan neural interface and then into Mjolnir as fast as those wires will allow the signal to be transmitted. And it just so happens that digital signals move through circuits at 90% the speed of light, or 270,000 meters per second. When you factor that in with the fact that it's got to send those signals then out to a movement interpreter and then out to the respective articulators of, in this case, the bicep, thought to motion happens in 3.6 nanoseconds, or basically 50 million times faster than a Spartan's reaction time. But again, there is some room for error in that calculation, and I will be making a video to extrapolate this further, so stay tuned for that. And finally, all Mjolnir should look identical. Allow me to explain. Before the more recent law, all Mjolnir platforms looked exactly the same. They were androgynous. They were all green with matte black underplates. They had no external marking, no numbers on the chest, no separate variants, no identifying markers whatsoever. In fact, it was actually a point of mild frustration for the Spartan 2s that they all looked identical to each other, wearing their armour, and yet Dr. Halsey could tell them apart simply based on the way they walked. Obviously, in newer, more recent lore, they've differentiated the unique permutations and identities of specific Spartans by giving them their own variants and their numbers on their chest, but it was originally intended that they would all look identical. And this may have actually played a role in why Spartans, or specifically the Master Chief, is called Demon by the Covenant. Not just because he could kill endless hordes of their forces, but because they could encounter one Spartan on the battlefield on one colony, realizing that they stood no chance of taking that Spartan down on the colony and thus withdrawing to orbit, where they would then orbitally bombard the planet. They would then think that Spartan dead, go to another planet, and find another Spartan that looks identical to the first one, and not being able to differentiate the two Spartans from each other, assumed it was the same Spartan, leading to myths being told about this individual that seemingly defies all odds and keeps coming back from the dead. And one final bonus for you, Mjolnir can operate in the air, on the ground, in space, and, despite what we frequently observe from in-game, underwater as well. Yeah, I know, it's unheard of, right? Mjolnir doesn't just fold in and collapse on itself every single time a Spartan gets their foot wet. Amazing. Anyway, they were 10 things that you might or might not have known about Mjolnir powered assault armour. Let me know in the comments how many of them you knew, and be sure to leave me suggestions on what you want me to cover next. Until then, thanks for watching. If you're new here and liked what you saw, go ahead and hit that like button and hit the subscribe button while you're at it so you don't miss my future uploads. Links are in the description to get connected and jump into the Discord community with me, and if you really love the content I'm making, consider supporting the channel over on Patreon for tons of awesome perks. Pop your comments down below if you have an idea of what I should cover next, and hang around for the end of the video for other suggested videos you might be interested in. Huge shoutouts to my patrons: Spartan10148, the Metarch of my installation, Falcon, Prophet, Phantom, Thomas, Mikhail and Irrefutable Justice, my monitors, Andrew, Cameron, Darian, Flaming Halo, Madness, Masked Owl, Michael, Spartan0137, The Cave Potato, Uwu Master and Wolf Eclipse, my sub-monitors, my growing fleet of Strato Sentinels, my ever-vigilant Enforcers, and all the other awesome patrons that are helping to support the channel in a big way. Huge shout out to Todd Morrison for keeping the installation powered with that glorious vacuum energy. Much love to you all, take it easy everyone, and find peace in the domain.